War's a dangerous thing. War's a dangerous idea. So in a sense, there are no surprises about today's topic. But one of the big questions I think you'll be hearing about today is the question of whether it matters who actually fights war, how we fight war, and increasingly whether it's human beings that are in the front line or something else. Does the future of war belong to robots, and is that necessarily a good thing? Our speaker is really the person best placed globally to really introduce these thoughts to you today. P.W. Singer, Peter Singer, not to be confused with the Australian philosopher of that name. P.W. Singer is without question one of the leading thinkers, I should say leading young thinkers, but youth is not his only attribute, one of the leading thinkers on security and defence issues in the United States and indeed in the world today. Please welcome P.W. Singer.
Thank you for that very kind welcome. It's a real honor for me to be here. What I thought I would do to begin today is actually begin with a dangerous idea through the form of a story. And for this story, you have to imagine yourself in Iraq. And ahead of you alongside the road is what looks like a piece of trash. But that insurgent has hidden that IED, that improvised explosive device, with great care. Now, by 2006, there were more than 2,500 of these roadside bombings every single month in Iraq. And they were the leading cause of casualties both among coalition soldiers as well as among Iraqi civilians. Now, the team that's hunting for this IED, for this roadside bomb, is called an EOD team, Explosive Ordnance Disposal. They're the pointy end of the spear in the effort to stop roadside bombings. So they're the military's version of a bomb squad. If you've seen the movie Hurt Locker, it's about one of these EOD teams in action. Now, by this period in a typical tour, a EOD team would go out on just about 2 bomb calls per day. That is, they'd be asked over the course of their tour of duty to defuse about 600 bombs. The number, though, that's maybe the better indicator of their value to the war effort is the fact that the insurgents put a reported $50,000 bounty on the head of one of these soldiers. Kill one of them, get $50,000. Unfortunately, this particular bomb call would not end well. And by the time the soldier got close enough to the device to see that it was a bomb, that it wasn't a piece of trash, by the telltale wires coming out from it, it exploded. Now, depending on how much explosives is packed into one of these devices, you have to be about a football field's distance away, about 100 meters, to escape death or injury from the fragments coming at you at bullet speed. In fact, even if you're not hit by one of these fragments, just the sheer force of the explosion itself is powerful enough to break your limbs. The soldier, though, had been right on top of that bomb when it exploded. And so when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, the rest of their team advanced, and they found little left of them. And so that night, the commander of the unit did their sad duty, and he sat down to write a condolence letter back to the United States. And in the letter, he apologized for not being able to bring that soldier home. He talked about how tough the loss had been on the rest of their unit, that they'd felt like they'd lost their bravest companion. And then he tried to talk up what he saw as the silver lining from the tragedy. And this is what he wrote, quote, "At least when a robot dies, you don't have to write a letter to its mother." That scene, that story, sounds a little bit like science fiction, but is actually battlefield and technological reality. It's the true story of the very first robot killed in action. That is, that soldier was a 42-pound robot called a PackBot. The destination of that condolence letter wasn't a farmhouse back in Nebraska like in the old war movies, but was actually a factory building just outside Burlington, Massachusetts, that on the side of it says, "I, Robot." It is a real-world company named after the fictional Isaac Asimov novels and the not-so-great Will Smith movie, in which robots start out doing daily chores. An iRobot that makes the PackBot also makes the Roomba, the little robot vacuum cleaner you may have heard of. But in both fiction and now reality, robotics started out doing our chores and moved on to fighting our wars. Now, to pull back on all of this, the book that I did, Wired for War, is about how there's something big going on in technology, war, and maybe even the overall history of humanity itself. The military that went into Iraq in 2003 had a handful of drones supporting it, pilotless planes, unmanned aerial systems, whatever you want to call them. The U.S. military right now has over 7,000 of these systems. The invasion force that went in on the ground had 0 unmanned ground vehicles like that PackBot. We now have over 12,000 in the military inventory. Last year, the U.S. Air Force trained more unmanned systems operators than it trained manned fighter plane and manned bomber plane pilots combined. Another example of the breakpoint is that right now, in the western states, out of all the defense manufacturers, none of them are researching and developing a single manned jet fighter. They're all working on unmanned systems right now. So the interesting thing, though, is that when we talk about these PackBots, when we talk about the Predator drone, we need to remember we're actually talking about the very first generation. We're talking about the version of the Model T Ford or the Wright Brothers Flyer. And we're really at the horseless carriage stage of all of this. If you think about the way we describe them, we call them unmanned systems. Like back then we called them horseless carriages. We couldn't wrap our heads around what they actually are, that horseless carriages were automobiles, that unmanned systems are actually robotics. And of course, we're also seeing other kinds of redefinitions going on. One redefinition is that of the term killer app, killer application. Traditionally, a killer app has meant something that comes along, a technology that changes the rules of the game. The classic example of a killer app is what the iPod did to the music industry, changed it fundamentally. This killer app is happening in war, but of course we may need to redefine it, because this killer app includes arming machines with everything from 50 caliber machine guns to Hellfire missiles. The point that I'm making here, though, is that that's what's happening right now. Peering forward, one U.S. Air Force 3-star general I remember speaking with described how very soon it's not going to be thousands of robots in our wars as we have right now, but, quote, tens of thousands of robots. And it's not going to be tens and thousands of these ones or the prototype ones that you'll soon see after that. It's going to be the ones beyond, because technology never stops moving. And there's a rule for this that we call Moore's Law. Moore's Law is the idea that we've been able to pack more and more computing power into our microchips, into our computers, into our robots, such that they basically double in their power and capacity just about every 18 months, constantly multiplying upon themselves. There's a better illustration I can give of Moore's Law. How many people in this room have ever received for your birthday one of those greeting cards made by Hallmark, for example, that opens up and plays a little song? Just raise your hand if you know what I'm talking about. Okay, if you've ever held one of those cards in your hand, you held more computing power than the entire U.S. Air Force had in 1960. In that one card. That's Moore's Law in action. Now, Moore's Law has played out over the last 40 years. So what does it mean over the next 25 years? What's the dangerous idea that comes out of that? It's the fact that our computers, our robots, if Moore's Law holds true, will be 1 billion times more powerful than today. And I don't mean 1 billion in kind of the amorphous way people use it, and back in the United States in our defense budget, 1 billion here, 1 billion there, and movies like Austin Powers, $1 billion. I mean literally multiply the power of our computers, of our robots, with a 1 and 9 zeros behind it. Now, Moore's Law has held true over the last 40 years, but it doesn't necessarily have to hold true over the next 25. What if technology moves at a pace that's just 1/1000th as fast as it has historically? Well, that means that our technologies will be a mere 1,000,000 times more powerful than today. The point that I'm making here is that the kind of things we used to only talk about at science fiction conventions, like Comic-Con, are becoming a point of incredible importance at places like the Pentagon. We've got to figure out what it's like to live through a robots revolution. Now, I was in California recently, so I need to be very careful when I say robots revolution. The dangerous idea I'm warning you about is not that the governor of California, the governator, is coming to get you, the rise of the machines. It's not that sort of thing. It's the idea that every so often in history, there's revolutionary technologies that come along. Technologies, again, that change the rules of the game. And what's important is not their capabilities, but the questions that they force us to ask. Questions about what's possible that we never imagined was possible before. Questions about what's proper issues of right and wrong that we didn't have to deal with before. And it's interesting when you talk to people and ask them, what's the parallel of where we stand right now with robotics? The historic examples that they give really illustrate this. Most of the scientists make a comparison, again, to that horseless carriage. They say where we stand with robotics right now is about where we were with automobiles back in 1909, 1910. And if you think about it, back in 1909, 1910, Ford Motor Company, for example, just sold about 250 Model T Fords per year. But spurred on by the demands of World War I, 10 years later, it was selling 1 million of them. But why was the horseless carriage important? Is it because I have a garage, not a stable? It's ripple effects. It's things like the mechanization of war, the mechanization of society. It's changes that it has beyond. For example, because of this technology, we have the advent of what we in America call suburbia. That is, people living outside city centers, commuting back and forth. Didn't have that before the horseless carriage. We have changes in geopolitics. A set of desert nomads at the time move into a dominant geopolitical position because they're lucky enough to live over a resource that's valuable to the horseless carriage. We have changes to the world climate itself, climate change coming out of this technology. We have the need for new laws. For example, what we call traffic laws didn't exist before the horseless carriage. And these new laws require an understanding of this technology itself. So the very first traffic laws entailed that someone was supposed to walk in front of an automobile holding a flag as warning that they were coming. And when they got to an intersection, they were supposed to fire a flare off into the sky. That made perfect sense in a world that moved at 4 miles per hour. Didn't know after the horseless carriage. Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, he makes a very different comparison. He describes how where we stand right now with robotics is where we stood with the computer back in 1980. If you think about that, computer back in 1980, big, bulky device, could do a limited set of functions. The military was the main spender on research and development of computers, and it was actually the main purchaser in the market of computers. But very soon, we learn more and more functions for these things that we call computers. And soon we get to the point that we stop calling them computers anymore. So for example, I have a computer in my kitchen. I call it a microwave oven. I drive a car that has over 100 computers in it. I don't say that I drive a computerized car. We're seeing the same thing happen with robotics. So for example, the new Lexus parallel parks itself. The new Mercedes, the new Ford, the new Volvo have what they call crash avoidance technology. These are nice ways of saying that the robot car takes over because us stupid humans are not good at parallel parking and we often don't look in our blind spot. But again, why is the computer important? Is it because I don't have to memorize long division anymore and do it in my head? It's because of the application of that computing power. Because of computers, billions of dollars can be made in a nanosecond. Billions of dollars can be lost in a nanosecond. We have changing social relationships that happen because of computers. I can be friends via Facebook and social networking with someone that I've never met before. Of course, I may be disturbed by my niece becoming friends with someone that she's never met before. We see the need for, again, new laws. Imagine explaining to your grandparents what identity theft is. We see the application of computers in law enforcement, things like data scanning, DNA, etc. But we all even see changes in war, and I think this is most illustrative. We actually see the creation of a new domain of war, a place we never fought before, cyberspace, because it didn't exist before. War that's taking place in zeros and ones. The final parallel that people make, though, may be the most instructive and maybe the most scary. A lot of the scientists who work on these technologies worry that we are, in a sense, repeating the parallels of the 1940s. That in the 1940s, if you wanted to work on what was hot and you were in the sciences, you worked on atomics. That was where the cutting edge of the field was. Same today. If you're in engineering or computer science, robotics and artificial intelligence is the cutting edge. But it's also, they worry, a bit like a genie that we might not be able to put back in the bottle. The point that I'm making here is that we often in discussions focus on the technology and how it works, where what's important in history is all of these ripple effects, the ripple effects on our wars, on our world, on our ethics, on our laws. And I'm someone who studies the war side of this. And so a couple years ago, I began to be very fascinated by what was going on in this field of robotics and war coming together. So I went around the world interviewing people involved in this. What's it like to be a scientist who builds a robot for the military? What's it like to be a science fiction author whose dreams are becoming reality? And a lot of them are actually consulting for the military. What's it like to be in the military using these systems? What's it like to be a 19-year-old sitting in a base in Nevada in the United States that's actually flying a system that's over Afghanistan? What's it like to be the general in charge of them? What do the politicians think about this? How's it affecting when and where we go to war? The war of ideas. How is this being perceived not just in our countries, but what does an insurgent in Iraq think about a robot fighting them? What do they think about you and me sending robots out to fight them? The narrative that's being told in the media, not just in our media like Fox, but also the media in places like Lebanon or Pakistan. And then finally, the right and wrong of this. So interviews with military lawyers, but also people at organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Red Cross of trying to figure out the right and wrong of the laws of robotic war. And the stories that they tell, I think, are fascinating. But they also shine a light on some of these ripple effects. And so what I'd like to do in the remainder of my time is walk through what I think are some of the most interesting and important ripple effects of this technology. Now, the first one of these, as you saw, is that while we may be experiencing a robotic revolution, it's not just an American revolution. There is a rule in both technology and war. There's no such thing as a permanent first mover advantage. So, quick show of hands here. How many people in this room have ever used a Commodore computer? How many still use your Commodore computer? The same thing plays out in war. So, for example, the British were the first ones to utilize the tank in World War I, actually inspired by an H.G. Wells short story, a science fiction story called Land Ironclads. They invent the tank. They come out of World War I with about 12,000 of this new technology, an interesting number because it's just about the same number of unmanned ground vehicles that the U.S. has today. But of course, if you know your history, they may have invented the tank, but by the time World War II rolls around, the Germans have figured out how to use the tank better. And so an interesting issue is that the Western democracies, and in particular the United States, are ahead right now in this technology, but they shouldn't be so arrogant about it. There are 44 nations in the world that are building, buying, and using military robotics. And they range from nations like the United States, Great Britain, Australia, Israel, China, Pakistan, Iran, Russia. And an interesting thing to me is not just what's happening right now, but where the trend lines are headed. Where does the state of our manufacturing economies, where does the state of our science and mathematics training in our schools have us headed? Or another way of putting this is, what does it mean to be sending out more soldiers whose hardware actually says made in China on the back of it, and whose software is increasingly being written by someone sitting in India? But we shouldn't just focus on the states, because warfare, like what's happened in software, is going open source. That is, this technology actually isn't like an aircraft carrier or an atomic bomb or a bomber plane. You don't need a huge industrial structure, not just to build it, but just to use it. Much of this technology is commercial, off the shelf, even do it yourself. So, for example, you saw that video of the soldier tossing the Raven drone, a little bit like tossing off a javelin. It's one of the most widely used systems by soldiers in Afghanistan. The editor of Wired magazine, though, built his own version of the Raven drone for $1,000. And so what that means is that we're having a flattening effect when it comes to war and the most powerful technologies that people can use. It's not just the big boys that dominate anymore. And one of the stories from the book that I think illustrates this really well, one of my favorite stories, is about a group of college students at Swarthmore in the United States. It's a university just outside Philadelphia. They wanted to do something about the genocide in Darfur. So they held a battle of the bands. They held a fundraiser. At the end of this fundraiser, they'd made about $1 million, whereupon they did what any other college kids would do with $1 million in their pocket. They entered into negotiations with a private military company for the rental of drones to deploy to Sudan. One of them I remember interviewing, and he talked about how they had to change the voicemail message in their dorm room because when you were negotiating with mercenaries, the message, "Hey dude, leave a message at the beep," just didn't sound professional enough. Now, not everyone wants to use this technology, though, to stop genocide. For example, the war between Israel and Hezbollah that took place a couple years ago was a war between a state and a non-state actor. But both sides flew unmanned systems against each other. And the concern of this is that as we see these trends playing out, I think there's two aspects to keep our eye on. The first is that it reinforces the ongoing empowerment of small groups and individuals compared to state governments. A graphic illustration of this is the fact that during World War II, Hitler's Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was not able to reach the United States. It was not able to send planes across the Atlantic. But a couple years ago, a 77-year-old blind man built his own homemade drone and flew it across the Atlantic. So a 77-year-old blind man had the power and reach that an entire Air Force didn't have back in 1942. The other aspect of this is the impact on terrorism, and particularly suicidal terrorism. It eliminates the culling power. It gives a greater power and reach and lethality, not only to an Al-Qaeda 2.0, but also to a next-generation version of a Timothy McVeigh. And I think the best illustration of this is from an interview that I did with a DARPA scientist. DARPA is the U.S. military's advanced research lab. And in it he said, if you gave me $50,000, I could shut down Manhattan right now using my current technology. And he was serious. But there's another ripple effect. It's how it changes our politics, our governance. There's certain social trends that are happening in our democracies right now that robotics maybe takes to their final logical ending point. In most Western democracies right now, we no longer have a draft. We no longer have conscription. We no longer declare war anymore. The last time, for example, the United States declared war was back in 1941. We no longer pay higher taxes for our wars anymore or buy war bonds. And now we have this technology that allows us to carry out acts of war without having to worry about the political consequences of that condolence letter going to someone's mother. And so what I'm saying here is that the barriers to war in our democracies, they were already lowering. And now we have a technology that literally takes those barriers to the ground. And I don't think this is a piece of political theory. I think it's playing out right now in the Pakistan war. You say Pakistan war, what does he mean? We've carried out more than 5 times the number of airstrikes using unmanned systems into Pakistan than we did with manned bombers in the Kosovo War just 10 years ago. But unlike the Kosovo War 10 years ago, we don't call it a war, even though, again, it's 5 times the size. And I think the answer to this riddle goes back to this technology. Because of this technology, because of the unmanning, my nation's Congress has not had to have a debate about it, either to support it in a resolution or to go against it. The media reports it very differently than it would with man bombers, than it did 10 years ago in the Kosovo War. It's being conducted not by a military force, not by the U.S. Air Force, but it's being conducted by a civilian intelligence agency. That means the leader of this air war is not a 4-star general, but actually a retired congressman from California who's been appointed to be the head of the CIA. The point that I'm making here is that what we used to call war, for some reason, isn't anymore. But there is one thing that it is, and that's a YouTube war. These technologies don't merely remove the human operator from risk, they record everything that they see. And in so doing, they're reshaping our relationship to war. Now, being able to see combat footage, there's literally thousands of video clips of combat footage up on sites like youtube.com right now. Being able to see this is arguably a good thing. We're seeing connections between the war front and the home front that never existed before. But of course, the ability to watch scenes of real-world battle on your iPhone is turning, for a lot of people, war into a form of entertainment. And the soldiers have a name for it. They call it war porn. I got a typical example of this in an email that was sent to me, and the title line of the email said, "Watch this." And we've all gotten emails like that. The video clip attached, usually is a really cool score in a rugby game, or it's a video of some nerdy fat kid dancing in his basement who doesn't know that we're watching. It's something like that. In this case, the video clip was a scene of a Predator drone strike. Hellfire missile drops, goes into target, explosion, bodies riding the crest of the explosion. It was set to music. It was set to the song "I Just Want to Fly" by the band Sugar Ray. We turned an act of war into a crappy music video. And the danger of war porn is that it's not just that we're watching, but it has a warping effect on us. This ability to watch more but actually experience less tricks us into thinking that we understand what's happening. I think there's a good sports parallel for this. It's the difference between watching, for example, a rugby match on TV, where the players are these little tiny figures on the screen, versus watching a rugby match in the stadium and seeing what a professional athlete really does look like face to face, which is a very different experience from playing in that match yourself and knowing what it's like to be tackled or something like that. These are very different experiences. But notice how when we watch the game on TV, we yell at the screen when they do something dumb. Like, how could you do that? Because we think we understand, but we don't. But YouTube war is even worse because we're not watching the whole game. We're watching the sports highlight reel of the war. All the context, all the strategy, it just becomes highlight reels for us to blitz through. The irony in all of this is that, again, it's not the technology that matters, but it all comes back to us. It all comes back to our human psychology. And there's a policy example of this that we're wrestling with right now that sounds very science fiction-like. What is the message that we think we are sending when we use robots in war versus what is the message that's being received? And I wanted to know this, so I went around interviewing people, and I thought the best example of the message we thought we were sending was from a senior Pentagon official in the Bush administration, who described how our, quote, unmanning of war plays to our strength. The thing that scares people is our technology. But what about when you go ask those people 7,000 miles away? And this is what the leading newspaper editor of Lebanon had to say. And while we were speaking, there was actually a drone flying above him at that moment. And he said, quote, "This is just another sign of the cold-hearted, cruel Israelis and Americans who are also cowards because they send out machines to fight us. They don't want to fight us like real men, but they're afraid to fight. So all we have to do to defeat them is kill just a few of their soldiers." I'm not saying that's accurate. It's perceptions, and they're perceptions that are going in completely opposite directions. And the danger, of course, is in a counterinsurgency, in a war of ideas, perceptions do matter.